So one of the interesting things that I discovered recently related to the money and debt and fractional reserve and printing money too much, because the narrative kind of for people like me that are not monetary historians or not legal scholars or anything, I'm just a guy that saw this looks like a scam. This fiat system looks like a scam, and there's a lot of us, and that's what Ron Paul ignited in 2008 and then in 2012, and that's what the Bitcoin movement is all about. It's people that see this as like, this is a scam, we want to opt out. And one thing that I discovered recently, which is kind of relevant to this conversation that I'd love your input on. So even though our debt is insane and every president in the last four presidents has like doubled the national debt of the United States, and the debt ceiling keeps getting hit over and over, and now it's a joke. When you look at it to the debt to GDP, it seems like we're not at uncharted territories in terms of the percentage of debt to the percentage of GDP of the US. And back then, they issued so much debt, but it was actually, now we're on par with back then with the amount of debt that we've issued. I say we, I'm Canadian, but you know what I mean? The world, really. So what do you think? Have you thought about that, about how our debt now is comparable to our debt back in the 30s and 40s, and like how it's different?
Well, number one, it's actually larger. I mean, we're approaching the ratio of debt to GDP of 40%. So it depends who you talk to, I suppose. That's one of these critical lines on the graph.
What do you think would be the main difference between the massive amount of debt that they had to print their way out of the, get out of the depression, and we should have, I mean, a lot of people think we should be in a depression right now, but because of the massive stimulus that the Federal Reserve and the Treasury did, they're kind of like blunting the effects of a depression. Do you think that it's working, or do you think it's just kicking the can down the road? Like, how do you feel compared to the 30s to now things are shaping up?
Well, take it compared to the 20s. The Weimar government engaged in massive inflation to pay off their reparations debt. And they actually forced France and other England and so forth and so on to make some kind of a reduction in the debt to deal with this. So is that the same situation here? We don't have a specific reparations debt. We have a debt that's been accumulated for other reasons. But how are they attempting to pay it off? Well, not through taxation. It's through the use of the Federal Reserve money machine. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, you're in the same position as the Weimar government. Is there a limit to this? Is Keynes wrong? I mean, Keynes's theory was there was no limit. You could print money and have people dig holes and pay them with this paper money and put it in the hole and bury it, and that was sufficient to keep the economy turning over, right? That was his whole theory. But you remember his book, Theory of, the initial book that he wrote, the German edition says in the introduction that this theory is more suitable for a totalitarian government than any other. I mean, that was a fascinating thing. When you read that, even he understood that what he was saying was incompatible with the kind of government they had in Britain at the time. This is the early 1930s, right? And one wonders the extent to which that's not going to be true here. To what extent are we seeing the Federal Reserve becoming the dominant force in the actual markets in terms of, what shall I say, if not direct ownership control, then influence on the way the markets are going to go and corporations are going to go? And is this thing actually coming back to a system that looks more like the National Industrial Recovery Act? You know, in the National Industrial Recovery Act, there's a thing called the National Recovery Board, National Recovery Administration, the NRA, right? Not the National Rifle Association, but the National Recovery Administration. And this was the titular head of the whole system.
That was in the 30s or?
1930s, right? This was the 1933 Act, Industrial Recovery Act. And that National Recovery Agency was there to control any, say, adverse activities that were going on among these corporations. Well, if you look at it from a structural point of view, that's what the Federal Reserve System is now doing from a financial point of view.
Right.
It's acting as in the same way as the National Industrial Recovery Administration was supposed to be doing in the 1933. So in a sense, we've come kind of back full circle with this. How far will it go? Heaven knows. The point of the constitutional monetary system was to put an absolute anchor and control on the ability of government to play this game. Because
Right.
the government could not get into inflation itself because it had to coin money. It could spend only the money that it taxed from the population. It could borrow only money that was real money, not banknotes, right?
Mhm.
It could make only gold and silver legal tender in payment of debts. What people wanted to do on their own in the marketplace was their business, and that would result in contractual disputes in the courts, right? So they weren't limiting uses of other forms of money or other monetary arrangements. The only limitation on the banks, well, there were twofold limitations on the banks. One was fraud. I mean, some banks could have engaged in fraudulent practice. And the other was, if they exceeded their fractional reserve capabilities, they couldn't pay their debts, bankruptcy.
Right.
Okay? You had a limited system. And importantly, the government was the thing that was limited. There was no way the government could come in and bail itself out through expansion of the money supply, or bail out special interests in the private sector through that same mechanism. So what did the government do? Well, it created the Federal Reserve structure, right? And the Federal Reserve structure has now become this cornucopia of quote unquote purchasing power being used by the government to circumvent all of those limitations. Well, now you add to the fact that the government in Washington regulates states and localities, not because it has the direct power to do it in many instances, but because it attaches regulations, guidelines, and so forth and so on to spending legislation. So it tells the states, we'll give you this money if you will comply with this set of regulations and guidelines. We can't enforce those regulations and guidelines on you directly because we don't have the constitutional authority to do that at the national level. But we do have the constitutional authority to spend, and we will impose conditions on your receipt of this money. And the Supreme Court, see, this is where the whole system's rotten. The Supreme Court came out in a number of cases and said, oh, that's fine. The mere fact that the government cannot impose these regulations directly does not in any way impugn the constitutionality of this spending legislation. Well, my God, this is a recipe for bribery, ultimate bribery. If you have a cornucopia of money production, and you're going to go to the states which cannot print their own money, right? No state shall emit bills of credit. No state shall coin money. Every state has to make gold and silver legal tender payment of debts. So the states are completely restrained monetarily. If you can go to the states and say, well, we'll give you as much money potentially as you may want or you may like, all you have to do is comply with these regulations which are otherwise unconstitutional because we can't impose those directly.
Right.
Well, now you've completely undermined the whole constitutional system. So the whole constitutional system has been destroyed in principle by destroying the monetary controls. And that all comes back to, well, two things. First, the legal tender statutes in the Civil War, which were repudiated later on. I mean, everybody looked at that and said, that was a big mistake. We should never have done that. And then the Federal Reserve System, which has had its own expansionary policies going on in terms of its powers and so forth. And so the monetary system, or the failure to apply the monetary controls built into the Constitution, has destroyed the entire structure of constitutional restraint.